Before we get started, you can ask me to annotate if you'd like me to. All right, class, so welcome to Module 3. We're halfway done. I just wanted to go through a quick announcement. So I've posted and published all the Module 3 material, and I'll take us through that. The only thing you have due this week, so you do have one assignment due on Sunday, but otherwise you have a little bit of a break. It's just a Labster lab, and it's on endocrinology, which will be what Chapter 15 is. So we'll get through half of Chapter 15 tonight. We'll do the second half on Tuesday, but you should still be able to do that Labster lab as they walk you through it. Endocrinology is a really interesting topic, so I hope you enjoy learning about that. And then we have almost 70 people in our class, so I'm going to try to get everything graded by this weekend. So that means your case studies, and that's usually 30 easy extra points. You know, if you did it and did the 2 replies and had a reference and got the word count, I basically give you the points to you. And then I still need to add the extra points, the 2 extra points to your exam. So just keep that in mind. I'll try to get it done by this weekend or Monday. But let's just take a look at Module 3 quick. And I told the people before the recording, but I was able to read through all my evaluations, and I really appreciate all the feedback. It's all anonymous. I can't promise a perfect class or a perfect semester, because no instructor is perfect, but I do take your considerations to heart, so I really appreciate that. This is my first semester being evaluated in an online setting, so it was interesting to see the comments versus in person. But anyway, I really appreciate it. So here's Module 3. This will take us through, I think it's right before Thanksgiving. We get through 4 chapters in this module, and basically we're getting through endocrinology, blood, and the heart. So this is a really interesting topic. So I'm hoping it'll be interesting to you too. We have 4 labs to do, 1 every week. The case study you can already start working on. And then, like usual, the lecture exam will be the Tuesday after the module ends. For those of you who are freaking out a little bit, the current lecture exam, I forgot to make the video turn on. So I think some of you were getting a little nervous, but for other lecture exams, it will be video recording you as well. I'm hoping, and I'm trying to set it up so that you guys are able to go back to a question too. So I took that consideration to heart as well. Like usual, many of you wanted study guides, and I don't provide study guides for a couple different reasons, but I will continue doing I'm trying to condense my PowerPoints, take out extra slides, and I'll try to keep kind of focus your studying on what you need to know. So that's kind of the way I give you study tips. All right, so let's jump into the endocrine system, not the nervous system. You guys are sick of that. So this is just part 1, giving us a little bit of an introduction, how hormones work, and what the endocrine system is. There is a workshop on the endocrine system called Hormones. And even if you can't get to the hormone workshop itself, you can fill out the packet. If you need help with filling out that packet, you can ask to speak to an online tutor. You can watch the video on hormones and then fill out the packet. And that goes along really nicely with this chapter. Just a reminder, you do need to complete those 3 workshops before the end of the semester too. All right, so your endocrine system acts with your nervous system. So we never can fully leave the nervous system behind, because your nervous system basically controls all of your other body systems. So your endocrine and your nervous system act together to coordinate and integrate the activity of all of your body cells. And it does that, it influences metabolic activities. And whenever you see the word metabolic, that's the idea of your body taking in some sort of food source and turning it into energy. And that can happen in a variety of your cells. And it controls or influences those metabolic activities via hormones. And those are always transported in the blood. The responses in the endocrine system are much slower than your nervous system, but they're longer lasting. And endocrinology is the study of hormones and the endocrine organs. So this is a little bit of comparison of your nervous and endocrine system. Basically, what we just talked about in your nervous system, you know that everything responds really, really rapidly in your nervous system. So for example, if you want to take a drink of water, your brain moves your arm over and you drink that water. So responses happen instantaneously in your nervous system, but they're much shorter lasting. In the endocrine system, it initiates responses much more slowly and the response, it has a lot longer duration. It also acts at diffuse locations, which means that hormones can travel through the blood and act on a target organ very far away from where the hormone was released. So that's what we mean when we say that hormones act over long distances. They could be released from the pituitary gland in the brain and act on a cell somewhere else in the body. Your endocrine system controls and integrates reproduction, so controlling when people go through puberty, growth and development, maintenance of all your electrolyte, water, and nutrient balance levels of the blood, regulation of all cellular metabolism and energy balance, and the mobilization of body defenses. We divide glands in the body into exocrine glands and endocrine glands, and we're going to focus on endocrine glands that produce hormones. Exocrine glands produce non-hormonal substances like sweat and saliva, and they have ducts or tubes that carry their secretion to a membrane surface. So for example, your sweat glands in your skin are exocrine glands because they directly secrete their substance, sweat, to the skin surface. Endocrine glands lack ducts. That means that when endocrine glands produce hormones, those hormones go directly into the bloodstream, and the blood acts as their conduction system instead of a duct. The endocrine glands in the body are your pituitary, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, and pineal glands. The hypothalamus, which is just above your pituitary gland, is what we call a neuroendocrine organ because it has some neurons running through it as well. Some glands in the body have both exocrine and endocrine functions. So your pancreas, for example, secretes hormones, insulin and glucagon, as the endocrine function, but the pancreas also has an exocrine function because it secretes all of your digestive enzymes and juices through a duct that goes directly into your gut or your small intestine. The gonads and placenta also have both types of functions. Other tissues and organs also produce hormones in the body. Your adipose cells, the thymus cells, and the walls of the small intestine produce different hormones to help with digestion. Your stomach, your kidney, and your heart produces a hormone, and we'll get to that too. So here are the location of selected endocrine organs throughout the body. I took a look at your next exam, and you will have a labeling picture that looks like this, labeling the different endocrine glands throughout the body. So make sure you know, and we'll go through this as we go through the chapter, but the pineal gland kind of sits behind your hypothalamus, and I know it's kind of hard to see. Here's your hypothalamus, and then the pituitary gland is the one right below that. So the pineal gland, which sits right, but kind of in the back here. So here's your pineal gland that secretes melatonin. It regulates your sleep-wake cycle. The thalamus is kind of the area right in the middle where my laser is. The hypothalamus is right underneath that, which has some neuroendocrine functions. And then the pituitary gland, again, where my laser is, where I drew that arrow, that secretes many hormones as well. Your thyroid gland sits around your larynx, and the parathyroid gland is on the back part of it. It's kind of the shape of 4 pea-sized structures. Then your thymus is kind of around your esophagus and the mediastinum, where your aorta will be. Then we have the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. The pancreas kind of slides in between the two. And then our gonads, the ovaries and testes, are also endocrine glands because they'll secrete different hormones. So again, knowing a picture like this or similar labeling endocrine organs in the body will be on your next exam. So chemical messengers of your endocrine system are hormones. They are long-distance chemical signals. They travel in blood or lymph. Autocrines and paracrines are different chemicals. We won't get into too much about them. We're going to focus on hormones. Autocrines are chemicals that exert the effects on the same cells that secrete them. So an autocrine, it will exert an effect on itself. And a paracrine is a locally acting chemical that affects the cells other than those that secrete them. Autocrine and paracrines are local chemical messengers, and they're not technically considered part of the endocrine system. So don't worry too much about that. 2 main classes of hormones. They're either amino acid-based hormones or steroids. And that just means the amino acid-based hormones are basically, they're the ones that are going on to form peptides and proteins because they are made of amino acid subunits. Steroids will be synthesized from cholesterol. These are some of your gonadal and adrenocortical hormones, which we'll go over a little bit, and don't worry about eicosanoids. So though hormones circulate systemically through the blood, and hormones can circulate throughout the entire body, they will only affect the cells that have specific receptors for them. And the target cell is the tissue with receptors for that specific hormone. And hormones are very specific in which target cell they will activate because they will bind specifically with a receptor on that target cell. Some hormone actions on target cells, they can alter the plasma membrane permeability or the membrane potential by opening or closing ion channels. They can stimulate the synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. They can activate or deactivate enzymes. They can induce a secretory activity to secrete something. They can also stimulate mitosis or dividing, which would lead to growth of cells in the body. Hormones act in one of two ways, depending on their chemical nature. So hormones can be water soluble or lipid soluble. And if a hormone is water soluble, that means they cannot enter the cell. Because remember, the cell membrane is made up of a lipid bilayer, and water and lipid can't mix. So water soluble hormones cannot enter the cell. So what they'll do is they will act on a receptor on the cell membrane, and they'll go through what we call a G protein kind of relay race as they pass on their message through a secondhand source for the information to get into that target cell. Lipid soluble hormones can enter the cell because they're made of lipids. The plasma membrane is made of lipids, so they can get through the plasma membrane and enter the cell. So they will act on intracellular receptors on the inside. And most of these receptors, if a lipid soluble hormone gets to the inside of the cell, it's usually getting to the nucleus. So these ones will help activate genes and protein transcription and translation to create proteins. Hormone release. Blood levels of hormones are controlled by what we call a negative feedback system. And that just means that the increased hormone effects on a target organ can inhibit further hormone release. So that just means that, let's say your body has enough or adequate thyroid hormone. Once that level of thyroid hormone is reached, it tells the brain to stop producing more thyroid hormone. So that's a negative feedback system. Levels vary only within a narrow desirable range because we always want to maintain homeostasis of these hormone levels. And hormone release is triggered by endocrine gland stimuli. So something that would stimulate an endocrine gland, as well as nervous system modulation. So endocrine glands are stimulated to synthesize and release hormones in response to one of three stimuli. And I'll go over these rather quickly. There might be just one question on your lecture exam about this or none, but these are just ways that endocrine glands can be stimulated to synthesize and release a hormone. So a humoral stimuli would be a change in a blood level of an ion or a nutrient. So for example, calcium levels in the blood. If calcium levels get too low, so declining levels of calcium, this stimulates the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone, which causes calcium concentration levels to rise. So this is a humoral stimulus from changing blood levels of an ion or a nutrient. A neural stimulus is when nerve fibers stimulate hormonal release. Remember our sympathetic nervous system, which you all love by now. They stimulate your adrenal medulla, which is a part of the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys to secrete catecholamines, which is a type of hormone that is a part of your adrenaline or fight or flight response. Hormonal stimuli, what this means is that hormones in themselves can stimulate another endocrine organ to release another hormone. So we have some hormones from the hypothalamus that stimulate the release of most of the pituitary hormones. The anterior pituitary hormones then go on to stimulate a target cell to secrete still another hormone. And we get what we call this hypothalamus pituitary target endocrine organ feedback loop, where hormones from the final target organs will inhibit the release of the anterior pituitary organs or hormones in a kind of negative feedback mechanism. And we'll go over this kind of feedback loop when we go over some of those hormones, because that feedback loop is really common. We have our hypothalamus shown here. Will secrete what we call releasing hormones. The releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone that acts on a target gland, either the thyroid, the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland, or a gonad, to release even more hormones. And then those hormones will go on in turn to tell the pituitary gland, all right, negative feedback, there's enough of us, you can turn off. And we'll come back to kind of this flow chart idea of hormones as well. Nervous system can make adjustments to hormone levels when needed. The nervous system can always override normal endocrine control. So for example, if you're under severe stress, the hypothalamus in your sympathetic nervous system will override insulin to allow blood glucose levels to increase to get your body ready for fighting and flighting, because they'll need that glucose to be turned into energy in your body cells. All right, so the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland or the hypophysis via a stop called the infundibulum, so that connects the two. The pituitary gland secretes at least 8 major hormones, and it has 2 lobes to it. The posterior pituitary is composed of neural tissue, so it secretes neural hormones, and the anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue, and we'll talk about kind of what that means. The posterior lobe is neural tissue, and I'll show you a picture eventually what I'm talking about this, but so we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and the posterior side of the pituitary gland is a downgrowth of the brain, so it's all neural tissue, and it maintains a neural connection to the hypothalamus via what we call the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. And there might be a question on your lecture exam, just understanding that this is the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior lobe of the pituitary. It runs through the infundibulum, and that tract is just how the hypothalamus interacts or controls or basically communicates with the posterior pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary gland only secretes 2 hormones, and this is often a popular test question as well. What are the 2 hormones that the posterior pituitary gland secretes? And it's oxytocin and ADH. These hormones, because they're kind of a neural base, they're stored in axon terminals in the posterior pituitary, and then they will be released into the blood when the neurons fire. So here we have this communication system between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamic neurons will synthesize oxytocin or ADH. Again, those are the 2 hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin and ADH will be transported down the axons of what we call the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. And what that means is this is like basically nervous tissue. It's a downgrowth of the brain that has formed this posterior lobe. Oxytocin and ADH will be stored in axon terminals as shown here, and they'll be released when the associated neurons fire into capillaries or the blood. The anterior lobe is glandular tissue. So basically, because the anterior lobe is glandular tissue, it's connected to the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system. And this consists just of different plexuses of capillaries and veins. The hypothalamus will secrete what we call releasing and inhibiting hormones that will act on the anterior pituitary to regulate hormone secretion. So now this is looking at how the hypothalamus interacts with the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So when the appropriate is stimulated, the hypothalamus neurons will secrete releasing or inhibiting hormones. And they're all shown here. We'll talk a little bit about what they are, but you'll notice about all these abbreviated letters, they always end in RH or IH, and that means releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. So if you see an RH or an IH, it's coming from the hypothalamus to act on the anterior pituitary gland. These hormones will travel through the bloodstream now. So the neurons will control when they're released, but the hormones itself will travel through the bloodstream. So there's no neural connection. It's through the bloodstream, and they travel through that hypophyseal portal system. And in response to releasing hormones, then the anterior pituitary gland will secrete hormones into the secondary capillary loop, and this in turn empties into general circulation. And these are the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary, and we're going to go through these hormones and what they do in a little bit too. So the posterior pituitary gland secretes oxytocin and ADH. They're almost identical. They only differ in 2 amino acids. You should know what they do. So maybe this is a good study tip might be just making flashcards with one side being the hormone name, the other side being what it does. The big thing about oxytocin is that it stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. It also acts as a hormonal trigger for milk ejection. So if any of you guys have given birth or you've breastfed your babies, you know the feeling of your milk being let down. You also may remember that after directly giving birth, maybe for several days after giving birth, when you were breastfeeding, that stimulates your uterus to contract because oxytocin is the hormone that controls uterine contractions and milk ejection. The milk ejection, not the formation of milk, but just the milk being let down. So that's why sometimes the contractions several days after birth are almost worse than the contractions during labor and delivery themselves, because as a woman might be breastfeeding, that oxytocin that's letting her milk be ejected is also contracting her uterus. Why? Because her uterus was about this big and it needs eventually to get back to normal size. So that can sometimes take a couple days. Both are positive feedback mechanisms. What that means is that oxytocin, the levels continue to rise and they're never shut off until a final end result is achieved. In contractions, that is the birth of the baby. So the levels will rise until the baby is born. Antidiuretic hormone is the second hormone. So remember, we're in the posterior pituitary gland secreting oxytocin, uterine contractions, and now antidiuretic hormone. So those are the only 2 hormones released from the posterior pituitary gland. The ADH, basically what ADH does really simply is it tells the kidney tubules, so it tells your kidneys to reabsorb more water or to inhibit or prevent urine formation. So it basically is telling your kidneys to retain water. This is usually released, triggered by pain, low blood pressure, and drugs. Specifically the low blood pressure, if someone has lost a lot of blood, their blood pressure drops. The antidiuretic hormone will be released to tell the kidneys to reabsorb more water, because when your body reabsorbs more water, they're increasing the fluid levels of the body, and that will in turn try to increase that blood pressure back to normal. Antidiuretic hormone is inhibited by alcohol. So that's why if you drink a lot, the alcohol causes you to urinate frequently because it inhibits the antidiuretic hormone. So instead of your body retaining water, you're just constantly peeing it out. Also inhibited by diuretics. So a diuretic means it's causing you to urinate. Antidiuretic hormone means it's telling your body to retain water and inhibit urination. High concentrations will also cause vasoconstriction. So ADH is sometimes referred to as vasopressin as well. All right, so this is just a look at we'll see these charts several times throughout the class, just kind of describing the hormone and then what it does. What you guys should know is just know what the hormone is and what it does. You should know that these 2 hormones come from the posterior pituitary gland too. I include the next one, but we'll get to the next chart in a little bit too. Diabetes insipidus. So this is not to be confused with the two types of diabetes mellitus, which have to do with glucose levels. But diabetes insipidus is another type of diabetes that has to do with ADH deficiency. And it's usually due to damage to the hypothalamus or the posterior pituitary. So basically, if you have low ADH secretion, you won't be able to retain any fluid, so you'll be constantly peeing it out. So these people must maintain their hydration levels, must constantly be drinking. They could be disoriented. So this is diabetes insipidus due to ADH deficiency. Maybe a test question. I don't know. I can't remember all the test questions, but I'm trying to help you out too. So now we'll go to the anterior pituitary hormones. Taking just a step back, and I say this a lot, but if you focused kind of, this is a lot of information and a lot to learn. If you could just remember for a second that these are teeny tiny proteins that are traveling throughout the blood to basically control your bodily functions. It's a pretty amazing system that we have inside of our body, the endocrinology system. I think it's one of my favorite systems other than the heart. So I just find some sort of joy in learning this material, if you can. So now we have all 6 hormones released from the anterior pituitary. They're peptide hormones. They activate cells via CAMP, second messenger systems, all but 2 are trophic hormones that regulate secretions of other hormones. So these are the 6 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. We'll go through them. Again, knowing a symbol, the name, and then what it does is important too. There might be matching questions on that. Growth hormone, it's also called somatotropin. Not necessarily, you don't need to know the alternate names. You should know it's just growth hormone. It has direct actions on metabolism and indirect growth promoting actions, and it directs the actions of metabolism. So glucose sparing actions decrease the rate of cellular glucose uptake and metabolism. It triggers the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. It increases blood levels of fatty acids for use as fuel. The big thing that growth hormone does is it just encourages cellular protein synthesis, which means it's basically encouraging growth of all of your body cells. So it's doing that by encouraging cellular protein synthesis, but then by doing that, the indirect action is then it'll trigger the liver, skeletal muscle, and bone to produce what we call insulin-like growth factors, which will stimulate cellular uptake of nutrients used to synthesize DNA and proteins for cell division, for cell growth, for growth of the body, helping to form more collagen and deposition of bone matrix. It stimulates most of your cells to enlarge and divide, but the major targets are the bone and skeletal muscle. So growth hormone will be very active during puberty. Growth hormone release or inhibition is regulated by hormones from the hypothalamus, so hypothalamic hormones. So we see an RH, a releasing hormone, and an IH, an inhibiting hormone. So we know that these hormones are being released from the hypothalamus to control the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone itself. So we have a growth hormone releasing hormone that stimulates growth hormone release, and a growth hormone inhibiting hormone that inhibits release. So this is growth hormone inhibiting hormone is also called somatostatin. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, also stimulates growth hormone release, which I think is kind of interesting. Hunger and growth are combined, which makes sense. So here's one of these kind of flow charts that you might get used to seeing. And if you get confused, I'd encourage you to make flow charts like this. You don't have to write out or draw out the hypothalamus, but maybe that'll help. So the hypothalamus here will release growth hormone releasing hormone, which will stimulate growth hormone release from the anterior pituitary, or it will release growth hormone inhibiting hormone that will inhibit growth hormone synthesis and release. When levels of growth hormone are at adequate levels in the body, that level of the growth hormone itself goes through what we call a negative feedback mechanism. So it'll go back and tell the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary gland, hey, there's enough of us in the body, you guys can stop producing us. So that's the flow chart for growth hormone. And again, the releasing and inhibiting hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus that act on the anterior pituitary to actually release the growth hormone. And then these tell you the direct and indirect actions of growth hormone. You guys don't necessarily need to know specifics, indirect or direct, but what it's doing is stimulating growth of all of your body tissues. So a couple of homeostatic imbalances for growth hormone. So if we have too much, so if we have a hypersecretion of growth hormone, that's usually caused by a tumor on the anterior pituitary gland. This can result in gigantism, where kids can reach 8 feet tall. If it happens in adults, it's called acromegaly. So adults have usually stopped growing by the time you're 18, 20. So if a tumor occurs that hypersecretes growth hormone in adults, they'll get an overgrowth kind of in their hands, their wrists, their feet, and their face or their neck. If we have too little growth hormone, it can cause what we call pituitary dwarfism. So again, we call it pituitary dwarfism because it's based on a hyposecretion of growth hormone, too little from the pituitary gland. In adults, it usually causes no problems because, again, by adulthood, we've reached the height that we're at. So if our growth hormone kind of stops, it won't be too problematic. So this is a look at gigantism, now an adult man who probably had hypersecretion of growth hormone when he was a child. Thyroid stimulating hormone. So this is another hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland. So again, we're going through the 6 hormones coming out of the anterior pituitary. Again, the posterior pituitary just had 2, ADH and oxytocin. So we did growth hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released by the release of thyroid stimulating hormone is controlled by a hormone that's coming from the hypothalamus called thyrotropin releasing hormone. And we'll go through this flow chart. So even as you're, working your way through the hormones, this type of flow chart is helpful to do this as well. So your hypothalamus releases a hormone called thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone acts on the thyroid gland to release even more hormones, thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T. Thyroid hormones will act on a lot of target cells in the body. And if you know of anyone with thyroid gland problems, you know that the number of target cells that thyroid hormones reach are basically all cells of the body. Your thyroid hormones do so much in the body to control bodily functions from your nervous system to other parts. So that's the thyroid releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and then thyroid hormones. Again, what these dotted lines are showing you is that when the levels of thyroid hormones in the blood are adequate, that the level itself, once it reaches the certain homeostatic perfect level, that level then will cause a negative feedback response to tell your hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to shut off producing those hormones. Third hormone released from the pituitary, anterior pituitary, is adrenocorticotropic hormone called ACTH. ACTH tells the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of the adrenal gland that sits on top of your kidneys, to release corticosteroids. It's triggered by a daily rhythm. It's highest in the morning. There's internal and external factors that alter the release of this corticotropin releasing hormone, including fever, hypoglycemia, and stressors. So these ACTH works to release some corticosteroids. Go over a little bit later what those are, but this is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Gonadotropins act on the gonads. So these are FSH and LH. So these are, again, 2 more hormones released from the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are secreted by gonadotropic cells of the anterior pituitary. What FSH does, it stimulates the production of gametes. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the production of follicles. And follicles are usually the name given to the eggs or sperm before they're matured. Luteinizing hormone promotes the production of gonadal hormones themselves. So in females, luteinizing hormone helps the mature follicles of the egg. It triggers ovulation and the release of estrogen and progesterone. Luteinizing hormone is what will be the hormone that will kind of peak right before ovulation. So couples who might be trying to get pregnant or going through fertility treatments, they'll always look for kind of that surge in luteinizing hormone because that's right before an egg gets released, which is ovulation. And in males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone. They're absent from the blood in pre-pubertal boys and girls, and it's triggered by gonadotropin release. So we have another releasing hormone here. So this is the big hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's released during and after puberty. And it will be suppressed by gonadal hormones and also a negative feedback mechanism, meaning once there's enough of it, it'll be suppressed. So gonadotropin releasing hormone will be released from the hypothalamus during and after puberty to start the production of FSH and LH. Prolactin, so are we to 6 yet? I've lost track. Prolactin, you can see that they all have these nice abbreviations to them. Prolactin is secreted by prolactin cells. It stimulates the milk production in females. So this is what, the final months of pregnancy, this is what is getting the breasts, the mammary glands ready to produce milk. And again, it's the oxytocin that lets it down. And again, if you've been married, to someone who's gone through breastfeeding or you breastfed yourself, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's okay. Role of prolactin in males is not well understood yet, and it's regulated primarily by prolactin inhibiting hormone, which is also known as dopamine. This inhibiting hormone prevents the release of prolactin until needed, with decreased levels leading to lactation. So basically, if you're not breastfeeding or planning to, this hormone is probably being inhibited by dopamine the whole time. And again, that inhibiting hormone will decrease right before childbirth. Your body gets ready to produce milk, whether or not you want to breastfeed, which makes things interesting too. Increased estrogen levels stimulate prolactin because estrogen will be increased during pregnancy to keep the uterus and keep the growing fetus safe. So increased levels of estrogen will also get prolactin ready to get the mammary glands ready to produce milk. So this is the reason why behind the breast swelling and tenderness during the menstrual cycle, because these increased levels of estrogen promote prolactin too. And blood levels rise towards the end of pregnancy due to the fact that they're getting ready to possibly breastfeed. Suckling stimulates prolactin release and promotes even continued milk production. We can have hypersecretion of prolactin. It's not a problem in anyone except women who choose to nurse. Hyperprolactemia is the most frequent abnormality, and clinical signs include inappropriate lactation, lack of menses, which is the cycle, the period, infertility in females, or impotence in males. And the final slides just take you through all the hormones and use these slides kind of as a good review to just maybe make flashcards about what the hormone, the name, and then what it does, because there will be at least one kind of matching question on your next exam about hormones and what they do. So that's part 1, and I'll stop the recording here. We'll do part 2 on